Okay, so Josh, we're going to move on to the Jam here, which is a band that is another extremely influential band
I
that
know.
also, at the height of their powers, just called it quits, which we'll talk about in their bio. But why don't you run the numbers for us before I kind of go into their bio?
Yeah, definitely. We've got the Jam, and I'm pulling it up now.
There we go. So
So,
while Josh is doing that, let me mention that the Jam were formed in 1975 in Surrey, England. Actually, Woking, Surrey, England. Someone who is British will have to explain to me how the definition works, because it's Woking, comma, Surrey, comma, England. So I'm wondering if it's a town and a province, or
I don't know.
yeah.
I think that's the name. I think it's just hyphenated of the
Oh
town.
no, it's Woking, comma, Surrey, comma, England.
Oh.
So if you're from London,
I see.
England, right? So it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
not a hyphen. So no, it's not like Avon on you know what I mean,
Yeah.
or stuff like that. No, it's definitely two distinct commas. So I'm wondering
Gotcha.
if one is the region and one is the city, or one is the province, or different stuff like
Okay.
that. So
So Almad Khan's is their highest ranked album on Best Ever Albums. It is was released in 1978. It was number 17 in 78, and it is 168 in the 70s, and it is 735 overall.
Gotcha. Okay, I asked you this question with Big Star, so I'll ask you this question again, Josh. How familiar were you with the Jam before we did this listen?
Kind of strikingly similar. I think I knew of them, but I had maybe not heard any of their songs before. But as you mentioned, they seem hugely influential, because I picked up a lot of other bands listening to this. I feel like they are in this time period of British punk and new wave that I'm familiar with and like, but I've never I've heard a lot of songs but never placed the bands with them, if that makes sense. If they play a station of this, I would recognize a song but not who sang it.
They sure were, and their contemporaries that they're often linked with are the Clash, which
I
you
wrote
could
that
definitely
down.
tell, the Sex Pistols, and the Buzzcocks, who
Yep.
you also can definitely tell elements of, and they are mod revival. And so when we think of mod, right, the Who are the
Big ones,
the godfathers of mod, and I think even Paul Weller, who's in this band, is sort of known as the mod father. They call him later, but really I will go back and say I think the real mod fathers were the Who, right, in terms of everything, and the Small Faces are often also thrown in with that group as well. So they're a continuation of an idea of the mod idea, but also thrown into that era where they're with punk and post-punk and the British groups. And one thing I'm not going to get into here, because we can talk about this for forever, but we're about to get into late 70s Britain. And one thing that is fascinating to me about late 70s Britain, but for that matter even mid to early 70s Britain and 60s Britain, is this idea that you would identify with a group of people, right, that are like your cohorts, like mods or greasers or skinheads and stuff like that. I feel like that is a very British concept, because there really is there an American corollary to that, because there's Americans that will call themselves maybe punk or straight edge or stuff, right? But it isn't as uniform, I think, a part of your identity, your politics, maybe straight edges, right? Stuff like that. But this idea that there's these huge subcultures that dress a certain way and have political affiliation and have just whole lifestyle traits associated with them. And they're all over the place in late 70s. I mean, we're going to, you and I both, I certainly, I think you do have a little bit of an affinity for like two-tone ska, which is associated with the skinhead movement, and there's, ravers and new romantics and all these different people, and they're all subculture, goths, right? Stuff like, they're all these subcultures that are there. And, the Jam are in this mod subculture that absolutely influenced like what people thought they had to say. What do you think, Josh? What would be your group?
Probably like, Well, what
you
would
be
I
a
want to be?
greaser?
Like the Rude
Would you be
Boys
a-
or something? But
the-
what
yeah.
am I in? I'm probably
A
just
skin?
some, like, nerd.
You'd be a skin, but a non-racist skin? Is that what you'd be going for? Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't. The mod revival, I assume that means that the mods went away and then it's like come back. How much of a period of time are we talking about here?
So, I don't want to speak with authority I don't have on that, right? So I'll speak with a little bit of it when we get into it, just so I can, clean it up a little bit. But yeah, I think what happened was like the mods were considered to be like a 1960s phenomenon, and then kind of culture moved away from them, and then people just sort of restyled the mod idea, the dress and stuff like that, but in
Like a more
way
modern
that
mod.
coincided coincided more with like the punk ethos. So it took the mod, and that's kind of, you'll read about the Jam and they'll say that the Jam had sort of the elements of the punk movement, the politics, and the politics of the Jam are kind of funny because at first they were somehow viewed as conservative, I guess because they wrote a song about the British Empire that's actually on this album, sort of like what happened to it, but I think it was misconstrued as, well, they must be, conservatives, right? But they weren't, spoiler alert, they were, pretty left-leaning along the way. But they also dressed in suits, right? Kind of like that idea of the mods, right? With all the fashion and stuff like that. So yeah, so that was where they intersected, the mod suits and the mod sort of ethos on, pushing it forward and, being, and the other thing I should mention is that all of these subcultures in the late 70s and early 80s were like very violent subcultures as well in England. There was like a real tension in England in the mid to late 70s all the way through the mid to, early 80s, where you just read about, these horrible things. And
there's so much like worker like strife and up unrest, I guess, from what the little I know of British politics at that time. Yeah,
I mean, it was that whole era that led to Thatcher, right? In the aftermath and sort of like the government, there was a huge inflation, and a lot of England was, and this is where people have been wonderful in commenting on the YouTube page, right, about giving us context, particularly about like English history, like filling us in on different things and, what was going on. And this is where I would definitely welcome both folks that have a greater knowledge than us. But yeah, a lot of these music scenes in the late 70s, I think, were influenced by that battle between what Britain was and what Britain was going to be in the modern era, which it kind of, we didn't talk about Kraftwerk, but that's a part of what krautrock was too, right? Like what Germany was and what it's going to be. And I think that's a little bit of what was being reconciled with here by the Jam along the way. Yeah.
So two things. What group would you be a part of? Do you have an affinity for?
I probably would have been a non-racist skin. I think just my love of two-tone and just some of the stuff like that, and multicultural background, and stuff like that. In terms of where I grew up and stuff, I think I very much fall into that lane right there. Sort of with maybe elements of being in another lifetime, Josh. I think and this is not a Bruce, I in another lifetime I could have been a straight edge kid too. I think I really could have. I think you know me well enough to know how, if certain wires had just crossed on another thing, how I could have gotten there. So yeah.
Also too, you mentioned kind of the cultural group movement in Britain. I wonder too if it has to do with kind of the geographic size of the UK and Britain specifically, and because America is so sprawling, there's kind of like different climates almost at times, different ideologies, different West Coast versus East Coast types of things.
Well, people are probably like, why the hell aren't they talking about the music here? But there are some people that like we do that. So here's my 2 cents on that. I think that America, to some degree, is defined by the concept of immigration, right? There's always people coming in, and you can say, have we fully realized the melting pot concept? And you go in a lot of different directions, right? But no one can deny that a large part of America's pop culture is the idea that people come in and keep infusing new stuff, right? And so it constantly creates a novelty. I think from and this is where having done the research on Kraftwerk this week is really interesting in terms of doing this as well. I think that it cannot be ignored what the aftermath of World War II and a generation that reconciled with that, right, and then had kids, kind of like how we had the boomers, right? But boomers in America yes, we had a war experience, right? But the war experience for Europe was different because in both cases, right, America came late to both World War I and World War II. Europe lost a whole generation of young men in two different wars. America lost casualties, right? But we did not lose a whole generation. In many ways,
not
our
nearly
ascendants,
as many numbers as Europeans.
And our ascendants was kind of left with being the last power standing, right? Because most of Europe had been diminished either by losing the war or by being ravaged by the war, right? Japan had basically been moved around. I think China was not in a modern China state. And so kind of the world ceded, but, circumstances ceded America's rise, right? And that did not carry over to England or Germany or France or places like that. And so we're left with a whole generation of young people in the 60s even, we saw it a little bit too with these original mod stuff, but in the 70s especially, where there's a reconcile of like, what does it mean to create a new England or a new Germany or a new France? And also because they're more insular, right, at that time, and it's also the idea of what does it mean to be British or what does it mean to be French or German, that I think as Americans, we might not quite totally understand because inherently part of being an American is being from somewhere else.
Right. Also, World War II, the physical destruction of those places, that is a stark difference, the bombing of London versus, America not being impacted at all.
Pearl Harbor, but even that's far away from the mainland. Yeah.
Correct. So, America is relatively untouched compared to all of Europe and Britain as well.
Right. And I think that also leads to that thing where, from the outside, we see these very interesting things where we see to this day, right? We see these musicians who very much talk about the idea of a British, mentality, right? Or what it means to be British. And it's a real controversial thing, right? Because some of that inherent Britishness, right, butts up against things that are not what we would call woke over here, right?
Like,
what I mean?
Anti-immigration.
But I don't think it's as binary over there. You know what I mean? Because the concept of Britishness, and certainly we see it in France, right, where it's like the concept of what being French is, is always a struggle between traditional French and modern French values. But in Germany too, right? Do we go with the modern Germany that sort of reinvented itself in the aftermath of the Holocaust as being tolerant and stuff, but also on the other side, right, is this growing idea, of right-wing, sort of like return to like more authoritarianism. And
and Germany too had, the whole other thing with splitting the country in half.
Exactly.
That's a whole other can of worms that we're not going to go down.
So anyway, I guess that's a very long way of saying that the Jam was in this period in the late 70s in Britain that was a very interesting time politically, and their songs reflected the tumult of that time. Sound good? Is that pretty
yes.
good?
I mean, my first note for this album was British underlined.
Well, and from that we can draw a straight line to the Kinks, right?
Yep,
and
exactly.
Because to me, the best way to describe the Jam is evolutionary Kinks, because as I said often, the Kinks were a definitively British band that sung about British ideas and British landscapes, right? Yep. In a way that all of their other British contemporaries did not. And if you want to keep drawing straight lines, the straight line from the Kinks to the Jam goes into like a band like Blur in the early 90s that was the definitively British band, in the Britpop movement. Yes, there was also Oasis and Pulp, and I think Oasis was the only one that kind of seemed like they traveled outside of that British realm as much, whereas like when you listen to Pulp and Blur, it's like these are definitively British bands referencing definitively British things. And later there'd be like the Libertines, right, that were in that. So there's always these British bands. Arctic Monkeys, right? They're these bands that are definitively British.
Yeah, especially in the 90s, it would be the bands that you would import music from if you like them versus like ones that transcended stateside. And
it's important to note the other three bands we mentioned, because the Clash, while British, do not seem like they belong just to Britain. And you can easily see how America takes the Clash, right? Like they vibe very comfortably because of their syncretic influences, especially reggae and pop music and ska and stuff. They seem of a lot of different places in a way that the Jam does not, right? The Buzzcocks come from an equal parts American and British music tradition, right? That you can easily see them veering back and forth. And the Sex Pistols are a sneer that was also being reinvented in America, right, by the Ramones at the same time. So they seem very familiar. Yes, they're British, right, but they're as much in like a spirit that's sweeping both countries, right? Like the Jam is the only one that to me feels like they are for Britain, writing about Britain, and very much of Britain. And I think that even, the Jam did cross over with their last album a little bit, and they'd be here and there, but certainly the Jam did not cross over in the way the Clash or the Sex Pistols did, right? And even the Buzzcocks, Ever Fallen in Love was, if we're going in the 70s time period, was a much bigger hit than anything the Jam was putting here. But in Britain, the Jam were huge. And that's the thing. There's all these bands that were massive in Britain that as Americans, we kind of know about them, but Adam and the Ants, right? It's another one like that. They just, T-Rex, right, is another one that we talked about. Just bands that were massive artists here, there. And for us here in America, it was sort of, at the time when you read about it, it's sort of like, oh, know them, but more sort of as a reference point.
Right. Where does, I wrote down Elvis Costello too. Do you know where he kind of
he's
falls
American.
Into? Oh, okay.
Yep. So there's a big difference right there.
Gotcha.
Well, we'll talk about him plenty, but Elvis Costello is kind of like in the singer-songwriter tradition, a little bit in like the R&B tradition, what he was trying to do. He gets wrapped up in the punk, tradition,
I think that's
but
where
not all the way
him.
in.
Yeah.
He's proto, like what would become like nerd rock later, that's in there. He produced the Specials' first album, so he's there with.
Yeah, I don't know why I thought
like
he was British for some reason.
Yeah, I can clean that stack. Okay, I'll clean it just to make sure that I'm not wrong. But I was always of the belief that Elvis Costello. You know what? Let's clean that stack right now so I don't seem like an idiot. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's see. He is definitely British, Josh.
Okay.
So I'm wrong. Yep, you are 100% right that he's British.
Okay, good. Okay. I feel vindicated.
He did cross over to America more though.
Yes.
And maybe that's why I think of him as American.
And because, I definitely lumped him in with the Clash in that way because I feel like they were more recognized.
Well, 77, he's in the same period, right? And the Clash's first album was 76. And this one is 78, right? But the Jam formed in 76 and kind of rose to power in 1977 as well. So, and one of the first things you see in their Wikipedia thing is defiantly British is how it's described. So, Josh, you're not alone in thinking that that's the case. So, all right, we've malingered on this bio. Let me do a little bit more so we can talk about this album, okay? So, Paul Weller is the guy I think most people think of in the Jam. He ends up having a solo career as well. The rest of the band is bassist Bruce Foxton. He also is a singer and writer as well, and drummer Rick Buckler. They were joined initially by guitarist Steve Brooks while they were in school, but he left the band pretty quickly, and they reinvented themselves, or not reinvented, just pared down to a three-piece, should we say. They get a local following on which they're playing. I believe Weller's father was their sort of their manager and booked them at these places, and they were being booked at sort of men's clubs and labor organizations and stuff and playing these shows. The Jam's influences, as you might imagine, the Kinks were certainly an influence. In fact, leading up to this album, it's an interesting story leading up to it, but Weller basically said he went away for a while to the English countryside and listened to the Kinks. And and I don't know if you noticed, but they actually covered the Kinks on this album as well.
Don't bury the lead on that.
Which I immediately recognized. And so just in case you wanted to be a little bit more on the nose, they actually even covered the Kinks on this song we covered before. So, but yeah, that's Motown was also a big influence on them, which when you hear it, right, with some of the bass lines in particular and the harmonies and the construction of the songs, you can definitely get it. You don't get it initially, I think, but you can quite recognize it when you dig in a little bit. So they signed a record contract with Polydor Records in February of 1977. They released a debut single called In the City, which actually charts in the UK Top 40, so they're pretty much successful from the jump. And then their debut album, In the City, comes out. It's mostly R&B covers and Paul Weller original songs. And it's often compared to The Who's early records. Full disclosure, I've listened to every Jam album except for that one, so that's the one I can't speak to in terms of what it sounds like. The single All Around the World nearly breaks into the British top 10 from that. They go on a tour in Britain that's highly successful shortly afterwards, and we're talking shortly, right? Record company in 77, album released, right? Then in the summer of 77, they bang out their second album, This Is the Modern World, which was released toward the end of that year, 1977. The Modern World is a top 40 hit as well. I think I'll have to look, but I know there's an absurd amount of consecutive singles by the Jam that became top 40 singles in Great Britain. It's something like 16 or 18, Josh, like in a row, end up in there. I'll clean that stack in a second, but it's kind of amazing. This Is the Modern World, their second album, peaks on the British charts at number 22, but they fall into... critics seem to think they fall into that trap that happens to a lot of bands, right, where they sort of repeat the sound of the first album, and they think it kind of sounds samey, and that is a little bit of the context that leads into this album. Some other stuff to know is that the band did a headline tour of the UK after their second album, This Is the Modern World. They get into a fight with a bunch of rugby players in a Leeds hotel. I mentioned earlier, right, the violence, right? Weller actually broke a lot of bones in his body, and he's also charged with assault. He gets cleared, and then they go on a tour of America in March of 1978. The tour is not successful, which I think sort of sets the tone, right, for a little bit of their American career. They
much
actually
like
were
Kinks, right?
You got it. It's very funny how much similarities there are, right? Although unlike the Kinks, they did not get banned from the United States for a long period of time. They actually opened for Blue Oyster Cult during this tour. Yeah. Blue Oyster Cult sounds a lot different than the Jam. Yes. And as you might imagine, the Blue Oyster Cult fans who are not... hey, Blue Oyster Cult's a wonderful band, by the way, who are actually going to cover in a Cold Listen Hot Take. But the folks listening to them and the folks that were being drawn in by that British sound or even the punk sound, at that time, not an overlap for those that may not know. So I could imagine they were not super well received.
That Venn diagram is very small between them.
Exactly. And so, during this point, the Jam also has established themselves with that mod look, and then they release All Mod Cons in late 1978. And this is the album that breaks them as big stars in Great Britain, as opposed to just, well-regarded stars. It peaked at number 6 on the UK charts. It did not make a dent in the United States, so they're not there yet. Every one of the band's singles were in the top 20. They end up getting their first top 10 in November 1979 with Eton Rifles, which charts at number 3. And then they do an album, Setting Suns, at the end of 1979. That is where they go from there. So there is a little deep context on the Jam. If you want to kind of know a little bit of how this album is perceived just in the moments, this one is considered to be a little bit of a story-style narrative, right? Which, once again, similar to the Kinks, right? And Ray Davies in particular. And it's designed to be with invented characters and familiar settings for British listeners, which I think, as I was listening, definitely comes through.
Yes.
So there you go. There's hopefully, like I said, we're shotgunning these bios a little bit, hence the unwieldy nature of this, which I kind of like how raw it is. This is like our punk album, this episode. Josh, we've talked a lot, so now let's get into the music. Thoughts on the Jam, All Mod Cons?
God, well, it's kind of crazy how similar in influence they are to Big Star, right? Because I heard all sorts of things on this. I feel like they are punk, they are new wave, or at least presage those in a lot of ways, especially into the 80s. They sound, the Kinks influences all over them. I swear before I even started listening to this and heard the Kinks cover, I was like, wow, this band must be influenced by the Kinks. And sure enough, that was true. I definitely heard the the British like songs of Britain type of song structure, and like reminiscent or nostalgia for that time period. You have English Rose, which is a love song, and in that vein, the some of the songs too seem like they've been covered before by other bands that I never like fact checked at, like In the Crowd. That almost sounded like a whole song to me for some reason. And then they finished the album with Down in the Tube Station at Midnight, which I think is probably the best song on the album, actually. And it just, that those British, the love of Britain is through and through on this album. And it's very, if you haven't heard the Jam before, I would say they definitely sound like the Clash. That was kind of the big similar sounding band to me, but they are different in that they don't have that reggae influence to them. They are very like straight rock and roll / punk in that way. I did not, like we said at the jump, I did not know this band that well. Obviously, like John said, they were so popular in Britain, but they never made it stateside. So I think that kind of lessened their influence on me finding them later as well.
Well, yeah, and they ended up making it in 1982, but then they broke up, which we'll tie the string on at the end, because the breakup, and we're not revisiting them, so I'll tie the string on there. I agree with you, Josh, on that one, that they're more straight ahead without the reggae influence. They certainly, you will recognize them as being, to some degree, a relation of the Clash. I mean, full disclosure, I think I've mentioned it a couple times, the Clash is, if not my favorite band, one of my 3 or 5 favorite bands. I don't like the Jam as much as the Clash, because they more are stay in their lane. One thing I will say about them is that Paul Weller really can write songs, and I feel like this album gives you a real slice of life about what it was like to be from Britain in this era. And unlike the Kinks, who are sort of writing with a lot of nostalgia, right, that we saw in Arthur and aspiration and almost whimsy, that is not the case here. The punk influence in this is these lyrics are highly political. I mean, the last song that both Josh and I both love is pretty much about being assaulted in a train station. That's like, it's clear when you listen to the lyrics. I did read somebody who said the best way to listen to the Jam is to have the lyrics in front of you, and so I took their advice the second time I did this, because I caught a lot of it. I caught a lot of it the first time, because, I'm always listening to lyrics. But it does add another layer to the songs, because you can really see the song structure and the pointedness of the lyrics. There's a real art to being plain spoken but profound at the same time. Not a lot of people can pull it off. Paul Weller is a guy that can do that, and I'm a little bit familiar with his solo stuff too, and I've always been impressed by sort of the lyrical poignancy in there. So let me start by saying that, love the lyrics of this song. David Watts as a cover of the Kinks is excellent. It's a faithful cover, but it does have a little bit of a spin. It does what a great cover does, and going back to that Flaming Groovies episode where Matt, his brother, and I talked about sort of the idea between a faithful cover, right, like a rendition cover, and then one where you took a new spin on it and stuff, and the difference between that this one falls more in the revitalizing it, but also staying true to the sound, so it kind of halves the baby on that a little bit. Guitar wise, there's a lot of piano bass drum combinations weaving in with a traditional structure. This is definitely chord verse type of rock. There are not a lot of deviations from the theme on that. As Josh mentioned, there are some ballads, most notably English Rose. Those don't hit with me. Much like with Big Star, I don't like the ballads nearly as much as I like some of the other stuff. I'm not a huge fan of In the Crowd, actually, which is funny, because I know that's one of their better, well-known and better regarded songs. I know it's one of the few that Weller would play later when they go out on it. But I felt it started off very strong, and then that English Rose, In the Crowd period kind of slowed the album down for me a little bit. it found its footing again at Billy Hunt and kind of did there, and then ended with a real bang with a bomb in Wardour Street and Down in the Tube Station at Midnight. Both a bang in terms of sonically and what the lyrical content is.
Yeah.
I can absolutely see why this album is influential because, as Josh said, and I don't want to keep just naming bands and being referential, but it's hard not to see the next iteration of British music in the early 80s and how that was influenced by it. As well as, British pop music all the way through the end of the 80s and the early 90s. There's even elements of bands like Susie and the Banshees and stuff in here, and we're going to talk about them later. That's just one of many that I could mention that's in here. But another album I very much liked. We haven't done a lot of crunchy guitar rock, right? Like pop influenced guitar rock, and we did 3 this week, and it was just interesting to pile 2 bands, 3 albums on top of each other like this, because we really haven't been in that lane, and Lord knows we're going to spend a lot of time on that lane in the near future, in the late 70s and certainly in the 80s and 90s, all the bands that are influenced. But yeah, I like this one. Josh, how about you?
I liked it too. I think I only gave it 1 listen, unfortunately, and I think it would warrant a re-listen. I also noted that I think this is the latest album in the 70s that we've talked about this far. I know we try and go chronologically, but yes. I think this is like really, we're kind of butting up on the 80s here.
I want to say one of the random ones that maybe Matt and I did,
okay.
like in that episode with like Bob Seger and UFO and stuff, might have fallen right around this time period, but not in a way where you're going, I think.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely because I want to listen to those, read the lyrics like you said when listening to this, but you definitely get the kind of the unvarnished current view of Britain, right, versus the nostalgia that you can definitely pick up on that. And as you said, it's not like sunshine and roses there. It's like really kind of man on the street, what's going on, and warts and all type of songwriting.
I also think Britain is much more likely to write about class than Americans are. Americans will write about a lot of stuff, right? Emotions, manners, race, sex, stuff like that. But we hate to write about class in America. And I think I remember being told once by an acquaintance who's French, it's like, you in America, you always imagine that tomorrow you will wake up rich, where, right. In France, we always worry about avoiding being poor, right? And so it's like, and there's some truth to that, right? That what my friend said. I'm sure he appropriated that from somewhere else. But there is a truth to that because these songs are very class informed, as were Beatles songs and Kinks songs and Clash songs, and later on Oasis songs and Pulp song. I mean, Pulp, for God's sakes, had a song called "Common People," right, which was about like an art student slumming to pretend like she was a common person. And that's British are not afraid to write about class issues, in a way that I think Americans sometimes either don't write about them or write about them in wildly polar, experiences, right? Like being really poor or being really rich, right? Not being like middle class. And when we do talk about being middle class in America, we talk about it more in the context of, the fact that we're so boring because we're middle class. Or it's like, and in fairness, we were going to talk about Springsteen this week, and he might be one of the few guys that does write about class. In America, about working class. And I think that's what people love about him, is he's one of the few troubadours that does. But you can't help but notice that, the British artists are much more informed, and parts of their story are that. I mean, even bands like Black Sabbath, right? Constantly mention, we were born out of an industrial town, and that created our sound, and also we think influenced how people viewed us in the music press. And we always sort of remembered that we were just, a bunch of like people from an industrial town that would be working at a steel mill if we didn't, learn how to play the guitar.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Iommi did work in a steel mill.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, all the way down to like he actually did, right? So perfect. So yeah, so I think that's my thing. I really kind of liked being able to talk about a little bit of like the socio-political because that's like that's where I geek out. And I know it's not going to be something we should do all the time, but I do think it gives some color, and I think this almost serves as like the entry point for a lot of music we're going to be talking about in the late 70s that we're steaming towards on
Yes.
both sides of the Atlantic. And it's also an interesting entree because it's going to take us back to what some of the German music, right? The German rock, or if you want to go the term krautrock and stuff. It also kind of goes into a little bit of what was influencing the art there as well. And it's impossible to talk about stuff that came in the 80s like hip hop, right, without talking about the idea of class, right? And where music comes from in the underbirth, so or the undergirth of different stuff. So
Yep.
it lays the foundation even for that as well.
Yeah, this may be one of those bands, if you listen to this album, where you're like, almost like Big Star, you're like, what's the big deal? I feel like I've heard this before. It's because they did it first.
Yeah, I think the only difference is that the jam definitely seems couched in a movement of similar music, where Big Star, who's doing what. Like I said, the only band I hear that often talked about, right, is that,
Yes.
Badfinger kind of was doing what Big Star was doing, but in a little bit of a different way. Whereas the jam definitely fit in a period where you can listen to a Buzzcocks album or a Sex Pistols album or a Clash album and be like, oh, okay, these bands probably all came from the same time, and you would be correct about that. Yeah.
Yep.
Even Wire, to a extent, is a cousin of this, even though they don't quite sound like it at times.
Yes. Yeah, I just meant in terms of referencing later punk, right? Like this is the foundation for later punk.
Yeah, I mean, or it's at the forefront. I don't think of the jam though as sounding like a punk band. I really don't. To me, they sound more like a pop band. And to me, they are just an evolution of that '60s, much like Big Star. They're an evolution of '60s guitar-driven pop.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely feel like they're more punk than the Buzzcocks. I feel like the Buzzcocks are poppier in my mind than.
Well, it just depends on what Buzzcocks. Yeah, the Buzzcocks are definitely poppier, but the sound. Well, I mean, you can make an argument of how punk are the Sex Pistols, right?
Right.
Some people say they're a pop act, that just had harder edges and good marketing. But I think there's elements of all. But I do think that if you were to ask Paul Weller, do you consider yourself to be a punk band or like a rock band influenced by the Kinks? I think he much more would identify with the second than he would as being a punk band.
Yeah.
In the way that you think of, like, say, the Ramones or. That's hard though, because what is a true punk band? Is it the Clash? Because the Clash could also as much be described as syncretic or reggae influenced. They're as much reggae influenced like the Police are reggae influenced, right? Yeah. And I don't think people would call the Police a punk band, but they're in that era where they have the energy and are influenced clearly by it, right? So
yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
an essential question for another time, perhaps.